Basically, for this little workshop, the predecessor can be found from Tom Harrison's 2018 little workshop called Northern Barbarians and Their Representation, which he organized in March 2018 in St. Andrews, where a couple of us met, and I had the chance to meet some other colleagues who could not be with us today physically. Some of them are present virtually, which is wonderful. And then when Petra suggested to me that there might be this chance of squeezing in one more workshop for this year's program, I did not need to think about the topic for very long indeed, because this is a subject, a broader field, which is very dear to me and with which I have been basically working since 2005, my master's thesis onwards almost, not to mention my PhD and my current project here at the FIA. And because it is the assistant director's, my last year as the assistant director here, ending next July, it's rather wonderful that I was able to sort of provide this kind of summary and condensation of things, invite all of you wonderful colleagues to think about these topics, and then hopefully work towards a publication which would ideally come out, I suppose, in the proceedings and papers and monographs of the Finnish Institute in Athens, PMFIA. My own project here at the FIA has been entitled The Uses of Ethnography in the Greek Literature from Hellenism to Early Byzantium. I've been particularly interested in looking at the boundaries of ethnography, whether they be cultural boundaries, chronological boundaries. Where does, for instance, narratives of your own ancestors turn towards more ethnographical angle as you contemplate the past? Past is a foreign country for all societies when you go back far enough. Where are the geographical boundaries of ethnography? And also social, when you write about other social groups, for instance, where does this kind of slightly ethnographical attitude creep in a writer's, usually elite writer's attitude? Also, I'm interested in how ethnographically framed details are used to process different kinds of knowledge about cultures and identities. And of course, in each context, it's quite interesting, not mandatory for this workshop at least, but for myself, to think about where is the balance always between, broadly speaking, a profit, for instance, propaganda, projection of authority, etc., and then the amusement. So this old profit or amusement dichotomy in the way in which ethnicized elements are deployed in ancient texts. So, I suppose, of course, a few sort of housekeeping issues. In case of a fire, well, I suppose we should use first the wooden stairs. If they are on fire, we use this little wooden ladder to get out of this window and down the metal staircase. If there's a fire on Zoom, I don't think we can do much. What else? There's coffee and nibbles over there. This also we can't really provide for our Zoom audience. I am sad for that. But apart from that, I suppose, yes, we can set off. With the question, which I feel like we do need to address, is, although I suppose the presence of you all in here and the presence of my topic, etc., already implies that there is an affirmative answer to this question, whether there was a north or northernness in Greek thinking. But I suppose this kind of beginning is fairly canonical. One aspect, and I suppose an aspect which ties physical environment and geography and topography into the iconosphere and life of ideas, is the actual physical seasonal fact of northerly winds in the Aegean area. Coming from the north or northeast over the Dardanelles, this repeats itself with remarkable regularity every year these days, and probably would have also in antiquity. Hence, we do have the figure of Boreas, the personified north wind, as one of the most active, most present of all the representations of different winds. He, out of all these, well, Zephyros as well, the western wind, but I would say Boreas is much more active than the other winds. Especially to the Athenians, he, according to a classical era tradition, had abducted Erechtheus' daughter Oreithyia, hence becoming, in an anecdote narrated by Herodotus, a kind of brother-in-law for the Athenians themselves. And This, of course, reflects, as all of these ethnographical details tend to reflect actual real-life interests and considerations. And in the case of Boreas, we certainly have the Athenian, very genuine, very materialistically based interest in the coast of Thrace. We have the wood, we have the metals, we have the slaves, all from the Thracian coast and the Pontic area where the grain came from. So this all made Boreas good to think with for many Athenians. And then we, of course, do have, in connection with this Herodosian anecdote, we have the fact that when Xerxes' navy was rounding Cape Sepias, north wind was thought to have damaged the Persian navy just before the Battle of Cape Artemision. So Boreas was genuinely defending Athenians. So this is an interesting thing. Of course, this inquiry into the Thracian and Pontic areas would have influenced many other Greek societies as well. The Milesians, the other colony founders for sure. And we have a wonderful sort of middle ground in the northern Pontic area where Greek traditions, Greek inquiry, local traditions, local responses to the Greeks all shape the knowledge, which then ends up in a condensed and slightly modified form, often in Herodotus as well. I sometimes have also found it quite useful to still occasionally tap into this old dichotomy. Of course, it's a very technical and very simplistic dichotomy of hard and soft primitivism. This was almost a century ago suggested by Lovejoy and Boas. Certainly not the whole truth, absolutely not. But still, something which we may be sometimes able to use in thinking about these different kinds of strains of stereotypes and markers of northernness as they move down the literary tradition. For instance, Hyperboreans, pretty often they would maybe be classified for the soft kind of primitiveness, not even necessarily primitiveness, because I would say the primitive aspect is there, the problematic one, but softness in the sense that they are blessed, they are civilized, they recognize the Greek gods, indeed they have a special relationship with Greek gods. So although they are otherworldly, and similar otherworldly societies can be found in other cardinal directions, especially the Ethiopians of the south, there is a certain positive overall tone sticking to Hyperboreans. And this is something which gets to a certain degree inherited, especially, even until late antiquity. And then we have perhaps the paradigmatic hard primitives of the north, the Scythians, with Thracians contributing certain other reflections as well. So the Scythian hardness is not without its exceptions. From Ephoros, for instance, we have this idea that Scythians are the most just of barbarians, which then tends to sort of slightly get elided and even slightly thinning out in the later tradition. But it crops up every now and then, and it seems to stick particularly to the figure of Anacharsis quite a lot. But we'll be hearing lots about Scythians during these days, so I shan't discuss this too much now. So what's quite interesting as well is how, for me particularly, it's quite interesting looking at the tradition as a whole, how the various peoples of the European continent, so broadly to the north of the Greeks and the Mediterranean zone, seem to have been quite interchangeably attributed the same characteristics. These certain characteristics get borrowed and reapplied from group to group quite easily. Now, due to the nature of the Greek worldview, it is the Thracians and the Scythians who often stand in the early stages of many of these motifs. They often form the original ground of attribution, the original middle ground for many of these details, but these details are easily transferred in themselves. And the northernness itself of these barbarians' characteristics, whether physical or mental, were of course explained, as all of you well know, through a very wide range of interacting theories. The oldest one is what is usually called the climatic determinism, especially in the Hippocratic school, from the Hippocratic day era onwards, gets borrowed, gets adopted into a completely commonplace, completely common sense understanding of how climates and continents and areas influence human characteristics, both physical and mental. So there is this sort of continental determinism variant of it. Asians are like this, Europeans are like this. And this is already from the Hippocratic era onwards. We do have this so-called nomic essentialism, where people's customs and laws shape their character in some essentialistic way. Obviously, a flip side of this physis and nomos thing, where the climatic determinism represents physis and nomic essentialism explains things through nomos, of course. We do have astronomical explanation models which pop up from the Hellenistic era onwards, and particularly perhaps become influential in the Ptolemaic apotelesmatica, where a very weird, specific, specialist combination of climatic and astrological explanation models for Ptolemy's understanding of the characteristics of the peoples of the world explains the northernness of European peoples quite comprehensively, but it's difficult to judge whether that was a particularly common sense, particularly well and broadly understood explanation model in his own time of the 2nd century CE. But it is, to me at least, seems quite clear that this broader commonality of European barbarians was, in many writers, in most ancient contexts, influenced by these markers of northernness, which we are indeed interrogating in this workshop. We have from Androtion of Athens, we have this kind of preserved by Aelian. We have a quip, quite sort of broad brush quip, how all barbarians living in Europe consider it dishonorable to write things down, for instance. So here we have a complete sort of characterizations of all European barbarians. In Strabo, this is very common. We, of course, hear about Strabo much more later in the conference. The north of Europe is unified in several loci by many of their characteristics. And even in Herodian, in a historiographical mode, Marcus Aurelius is just very generally waging war, prostetus ta arctoa tes ges. So we have this recognition of commonality quite strongly. And the way it seems to me is that this commonality, this northernness, with whatever name we really call it, septentriography or borealism, and there's been many terms used for this one, I feel like it might help us actually overcome an aspect which Gideon Bohak over 15 years ago noted, that in modern inquiry into ancient ethnic portrayals, the problem has often been that modern national identities have really influenced the scholars in the sense that Romanian scholars have studied Dacians, Bulgarian scholars have studied Thracians, French scholars have, of course, studied Celts a lot, etc., which leads to a kind of essentialism in itself. And I would like very much to think that, we should take seriously the ancient perception of broad commonalities. Why wouldn't we? If there was a commonality of northerners or European barbarians for the Greeks and Romans, we should indeed take this seriously as something which was an active part of the worldview of these groups being Greeks and Romans. And the application of this same topoi within this broader category of northerners, we should not imply that these are modern national or ethnic labels would be in any way relevant. I mean, after all, ancient writers wrote to their own audiences, not for the modern historians' benefit. Now, of course, I've sometimes used the term septentriography, writing about the north. That might be one term. Christopher Krebs has used borealism, meaning the ideological underpinnings explaining the Greek ideas about the north and why the northerners were the way they were. In a way, their iconosphere. A subsidiary question to this is, I suppose, and I'm really interested in hearing all of your views this weekend, both present and online, whether we actually need a distinction between the perceptions or the ideas and then the literary communication using these perceptions, whether in topoi and propaganda. I mean, this is something which Anthony Caldellis, for instance, in his fairly recent Ethnography after Antiquity, he's also distinguished between the actual ideology about like ethnicized ideology and then writing using this or tapping into this ethnicized ideology. It may be a useful distinction, I would say. Now, what is interesting, considering, of course, Christopher Krebs's Borealism is very much coined after Orientalism. And there are reams and reams of volumes about ancient Orientalism for sure. It is interesting that ancient Borealism, or whatever we call it, images of the North, has not been very much written about in terms of entire volumes or in terms of entire research projects as such. There are some really influential and interesting and extremely incisive articles for sure. Apart from Renaud Gagnier's excellent recent Cosmography and the Idea of Hyperborea in Ancient Greece, I'm not sure where Renaud speaks very wonderfully of the Greek boreal imagination, which I think is a good option for the term borealism. And this boreal imagination, as he says, quote, endlessly reworks the same terms of reference into new shapes of meaning. Well, this is kind of what I'm interested in today as well, and to discuss with you over this weekend. And the imagery about the north and northernness and northerners, all these things, has actually been studied quite a lot in terms of medieval and early modern texts and iconosphere. We have Davidson's volume, The Idea of North. We have Images of the North, edited by Sverrir Jakobsson. And we have Dolly Jørgensen's and Virginia Langum's Visions of North in Pre-Modern Europe. But in all these volumes, there's just usually one little chapter, one contribution dealing with antiquity. So I think it might be time for an ancient twist on this one. And now, to slightly other topic, because of course, for the whole rest of the weekend, I am just really thrilled to be hearing from you and the discussions generated by your topics and your papers. I'm just going to give a really short run-through of my own little angle of things. In a way, a potted history of the Greek image of northern religion. Quick as anything, very general, I would say. I'm not going to make any particular point. This is just in order to bring a certain impressions of how different contexts shaped the Greek image of northerners, religiosity, religions, cults, rituals, etc. Here too, it seems to me that Thracians and Scythians are the first groups in Greek imagery that really include much comments on their religion. The Hyperboreans, of course, are largely defined through their relation with Apollo, a Greek god, or Greek heroes like Heracles or Perseus, who were both thought to have traveled to Hyperborea. But Thracians and Scythians are the only ones really who attract properly ethnographic, perhaps, or ethnographicizing takes on their religiosity. Several themes which later on in the tradition become very important in terms of other northern groups as well appear already in this early stage, from the Herodotian horizon especially. We'll be speaking about Herodotus quite a lot over this weekend, and I think that's really sensible because he is in some ways incredibly fundamental towards for the whole later tradition of northerners iconosphere. For instance, one typical textual device which Herodotus uses is the so-called list of most worshipped gods, which he uses on both Thracians and Scythians, and which we later get in writers like Caesar about the Gauls, Tacitus about the Germans, etc. So this list form starts with Herodotus, at least from him, if not before. Both groups, in their own ways, were imagined as practicing ostentatiously cruel ritual killing. So this ritual killing of human beings, human sacrifice, if you will, not the same thing, of course, but slightly interrelated things, are very present in Herodotus about both Thracians and Scythians. Also in Dissoilogoi, which is the sophistic piece of roughly the same date with Herodotus, and of course in Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris, similarly written in the same-ish context and probably interacting with Herodotus actually, which is quite interesting. Another early topic, and we'll be hearing more about this one from Massimo Giuseppe's paper, is the sacking of temples. And then, of course, the supernatural punishment for the sacking of temples. Herodotus writes this about the Scythians, and Thucydides writes this about the Thracians, where they sack the whole city and temples included at Mykalessos. Thracians were also the original wrong-believing northerners, I have not really invented a better term for this, because it's not just desidaimonia, it's not just superstitio, but they are also incredibly gullible, and their own ritual experts, let's put it this way, are very able to manipulate them, because they are gullible, they are, well, maybe it is desidaimonia, but there are also this other impression that they just hold absurdly strong opinions on their own gods while possibly rejecting other people's gods. So maybe this wrong-believingness is one topic. And of course, with Thracians, we get this incredibly influential topos of the idea of life after death, some kind of rebirth, some kind of transmigration of souls. Which then makes these northerners brave. This is already in Herodotus, the context. Herodotus mentions that the Getae were resisting the Persian invasion, and then he proceeds immediately into telling about their belief in the afterlife. So although it's not spelled out, unlike in later periods about the Gauls, the Germans, the British, etc., the connection is implicit already there. Now, Herodotus, of course, connects it already with Pythagoras. He does end up kind of rejecting this on the base of chronological grounds. But later on in the tradition, this connection with Pythagoras and the Thracians, and then Pythagoras expanded into the whole selection of northerners, is actually completely affirmed, embroidered, elaborated, involuted. We have Strabo, Diogenes Laertius, and many, many late antique writers as well, both pagan and Christian, polytheist and monotheist alike. Okay, that was the Thracians. Well, but Scythians, on the other hand, in their ritual life, were frequently used to explore the very limits of human ritual behavior in its most primitive sense. It's sort of mis en abîme. Human sacrifice, funerary cannibalism, very rudimentary structures, as in Herodotus is mentioned that the shrine to Ares in Scythia is just a pile of wood with a big sword stuck onto it. And this kind of idea of very rudimentary ritual structures is also pervading through the whole tradition. Then we do have the more soft primitive, or maybe at least positive, idea of the wise northerner. Anacharsis is the first one, perhaps, which becomes later a full-blown topos, and we do have this sort of wise peoples or holy peoples dotted also around the northern fringes of the world. Anacharsis' interaction with Greek beliefs is certainly more positive than in the case of Zeuxis, who essentially just takes Pythagorean doctrine, uses the superstitiousness of the Thracians in order to manipulate them. But still, of course, Anacharsis' story is also narrated ethnocentrically. He's the outsider who comes inside, affirms that the Greeks are actually pretty exceptional, even when he's teasing them a bit or pointing a sort of few funny things about them. He still affirms the Greek self-belief that, yes, we are pretty significant. The topics, such as this sword worship, which I mentioned earlier, the head hunting, especially among the Taurians, and generally the ritual killings of humans, proved very lasting details in the septentriographic tradition. While from the Hyperboreans, I would say the tradition received at least the elements of this ritual connection to woodlands, which is not yet there in Herodotus, but it does appear by the Roman imperial era, and arguably could have influenced this idea of northerners worshipping in groves. Of course, there was also a very genuine thing. Most Iron Age European societies would have had some kind of holy woods, but so did Romans and Greeks. It's not surprising. But in the literary sense, it could have been a minor influence there. And then this idea of happy suicides, because Hyperboreans from very early on are very happy. They live long, but then when they do die, they are very happy to give away their lives. Kind of possibly a more positive twist on this Thracian thing, where the Thracian belief in... So it could be a more positive twist on this Thracian idea of believing in afterlife, and hence being very happy to throw their lives away. And with Hyperboreans, these very positive, soft, idealizing elements, such as their piety, their long lives, their justice, that does continue to be cited about them all the way until the end of antiquity, really. Unlike these hard elements who seem to be transferred to others. My research in particular starting from Herodotus, but focusing quite a lot on the period after the Hellenistic period, or possibly so-called long Hellenistic period, has been exploring quite a bit the formative force of the encounter, the Greek encounter between themselves and the so-called Keltoi and Galatai, which takes place from 270s onwards. So this basically, based on this very genuine real-life shock and alarm and need for epistemically circumscribe this sort of new group of invaders, it actually seems to result in several already existing elements being given new urgency and salience in the Greek worldview, which then in turn, as the Romans would conquer most Gauls, Celts / others, would be transferred to other similar European Iron Age groups, the Germanoi, the British, the Irish, and other peoples. The idea of temple looting, because as you know, attack towards Delphi was a crucial event in these conflicts of the early 270s. It's not a wonder that the idea of temple looting would suddenly gain in salience from this one. The literary exemplar is easy. The exemplar are easy to find from the Thracian sacking of Mykalessos, and indeed Herodotus's account of not only the Scythian sacking of the temple of Aphrodite in Ascalon, but also the Persian attack to Delphi, which is almost a carbon copy exemplum of what we see Pausanias narrating, for instance, about the Celtic attack to Delphi. And of course, the theme of supernatural punishment for this kind of temple looting similarly enjoys a resurgence. While perhaps a new subsidiary theme, the fact that the Northerners just don't recognize the kairos well, because they have so much hubris, they have so poor understanding of the proper theandric relationship between humans and gods. They also misjudge kairos constantly. And this is something which gets repeated until late antiquity with many barbarian invaders and generally warfare between the in-group and the out-groups. As long as the out-groups are Northerners, they always seem to misjudge when is the opportune moment. Now, of course, as I said, epistemically circumscribing these invaders became very important. So mythological genealogies rise to explain. Usually cyclopes, titans, giants, other enemies of the Olympian gods are cited. And then slowly, the Hellenistic septentriography starts to crop up in the Roman context as well. First in Greek writers, of course, and then slowly in Roman Latin writers as well, such as Cneius Gellius, who also cites this idea of decapitation or headhunting. So we, of course, with headhunting, we have seen recently some research which seems to confirm that yes, we do have Celtic sanctuaries in southern France, modern-day southern France, with actual decapitated display of decapitated heads, etc. So we have a good example of an exo-ethnographic detail which actually does have a real-life inspiration behind it, but it's not necessarily true that its communicative power in in-group communication derives from this match between the reality and this imagery. The communicative power actually derives from the fact that the audience believes that this is true. They know, as it were, that it's true. It's not important whether that still continues in the actual field, so to speak. And of course, we should always remember that the dynamics of Greek inquiry into Northerners were both enabled by the spread of the Roman state, but also directed by the Roman interests. Both in case of Polybius and Posidonius. For instance, a good example with Posidonius is this way in which, according to the Scholia to Apollonius Rhodius, Posidonius seems to have attempted to explain the Helvetii of the Alps through Hyperboreans. He said that Hyperboreans still lived in the Alps to his day. So he seems to be tapping into this moralizing story where the Helvetii were rich and peaceful, and yet they still joined the Cimbric attack. And in a way, this is clearly an euhemeristic detail, where Posidonius tries to fit the old Hyperboreans into a new mountain range, which happens to be to the north of Italy. So we do have the Roman shock reaction from the Cimbric Wars quite strongly. The similar thing with the so-called with the so-called decapitated heads display somewhere near Massilia, which indeed, yes, we seem to have. We seem to have local Gallic traditions of exactly this kind of displays, but still Posidonius's description is similarly tapped into the Hellenistic iconosphere very strongly. Whether Posidonius was the one to actually write about the holy men of the Gauls, the Druids, the Bards, and the Vates, is actually quite questionable. He does not mention Druids by name. Bards he may have mentioned by name. The thing is, only post-Caesarean Greek writers mention the Druids, the Diodorus, Strabo. So what we actually do have is the imagery of Druids being quite firmly post-Caesarean, possibly projected to Posidonius, but actually there are many other options for the appearance of Druids in Greek literature. They seem to appear in the context of the Alexandrian learned tradition. We have Sotion of Alexandria, Alexander Polyhistor, and Timagenes of Alexandria, who all seem to me quite crucial for this one, perhaps. So Caesar's impact on the Greek writers should not be underestimated. Diodorus Siculus, even Strabo, even in their supposedly Posidonian sections, are post-Caesarean. They are Augustan or Tiberian pieces of writing, indeed. And some elements, such as Caesar's division between the Celts or Gauls and the Germans, actually percolates into the Greek tradition only very slowly. It becomes accepted quite slowly. And we also might want to think about how many Greek exemplars there could be for certain elements which Caesar writes about the Galli or applies them to the Galli. The so-called Wickerman sacrifices, the famous section in book 6.16. It could perhaps be inspired by the Herodotian description of the execution of false diviners among the Scythians. The Druids also manipulate the Gallic belief in afterlife, exactly like Zalmoxis does to the Thracians, and the result is bravery in both cases. Stick divination among Germans in Book 1 of Gallic Wars could well find its exemplum from Herodotian description about stick divination among the Scythians. So there are things where Caesar could be reflecting the written tradition as well. But of course, one detail which Caesar did not initiate was an explicit connection spelled out between Druids and Pythagoreans. This was also, just like the Druids, probably an invention of the Greek tradition, but as for by whom, we just don't know. Possibly Sotion, possibly Polyhistor, somebody roughly in the same chronological horizon as Caesar, but not him. Now, if any single crucial period for the coming together of the imagery of northern religion to this sample that we know from the later sources, to me it seems that Augustan era is really this one. We should not be looking into the Posidonian horizon, we should rather be looking at the Augustan Empire. So it's not a period when the hostile relations were at their highest, despite of course the Battle of Clades Variana at Teutoburg. But what we have instead is a process whereby these epistemic resources come together in a completely unprecedented way into this project of imperial knowledge ordering of the Roman world, of the whole oikumene, as it were. And authors then choosing different frame narratives to rearrange the received elements about the Northerners. Ethnographically framed information also starts to percolate to lighter genres, for instance. Parthenius's Erotica Pathemata, the Narrationes Amatoriae, is very interesting because we have loads of ritual details about Celtic or Gallic life there in a work of lighter literature. And in this Augustan horizon as well, it is all about the in-groups. The Northerners' role is often to mirror the moral failures of the Romans themselves, just like in Livy. And at the same time starts this active process of transferring the imagery to the still free groups beyond the borders, the Germans, the Britons, Irish, as well as we will be hearing later. And this is interesting because, for instance, in Strabo, the Gallic past is represented through the received topoi, the conventional imagery, while the present is implied to be different, but not particularly worth commenting on about because it's not as interesting. Of course, that's the thing. The past ritual details are much more interesting to include. So, you do keep repeating these same topoi for sure. They were too interesting to abandon. So we see in the imperial era as well this constant rearrangement, involution, and reapplication of the Northerners' religious traditions. Explanation models could, of course, confirm the established stereotypes. For instance, in Plutarch's De Superstitione, he writes how ignorance about the gods, if ignorance about the gods happens to infest moist souls, souls which are too moist in humoral sense, it can produce superstition. And as we know, moistness has been an established part of the humoral explanation models about the Northerners from Hippocrates onwards, and very, very current still in Plutarch's own era. So in a way, Northerners were even, in a humoral sense, prone to superstition, deidaimonia. But anyway, so this all forms what can be called a doxic knowledge. Not toxic, although it certainly could have been toxic as well, but toxic in this case. So a set of proverbial, commonly known stereotypes that only needed to be passingly mentioned or referred to in order to be triggered. You know, this sort of proverbial things like fides punica, ferocia germanorum, etc., etc. This is toxic knowledge. And this particularly comes together under the second sophistic. So what the sophists often do is that they invest these inherited, ethnically framed elements into their speeches and pieces in order to bring interest and sometimes maybe some allegorical value into them. Sometimes we have dismissive and offhanded references as well. Yes, final slide almost. And Despina Tsiafakis there, welcome Despina. So, in order to sum up the imperial era, I would say, negative elements which still stay relevant about the Northerners' ritual traditions is the idea of Northerners as deidaimonioi, superstitiosi, their belief in life after death or metempsychosis. Exactly how seems to be not very important. The fact that they just vaguely believe that there's another life or a new body for the soul or something like that, that's never particularly important. It seems that important is the fact that it makes them brave. The idea of religious experts manipulating these gullible Northerners, cannibalism still gets cited, although interestingly the theme of headhunting or decapitation seems to tail off somehow. But very powerful is this idea, especially for the whole early imperial era, is this idea of human sacrifice taking place in deep woods, especially in the Latin side, slightly less on the Greek side. Now, positive or neutral elements which still stay relevant are the lists of wise peoples, especially the Getai, Galatai, and sometimes Druids explained, used as an ethnonym, are all part of these lists of wise peoples, and their connections with Pythagoras for sure. Then these otherworldly holy islands of the Atlantic seem to be a theme as well. Tree worship, or indeed rituals in tight connection with groves. The more positive side of these human sacrifices in deep woods, of course, but both get cited. Outside the field of religious ethnography, we do have, of course, the physical characteristics of Northerners staying very well recognized, completely proverbial. There's no change almost at all. They are tall, they are white, they are overly moist, they are characterized by an excess of phlegm, they are reddish or pale with shaggy hair, and then physiognomical readings were drawn from these quite often, especially by figures like Polemo of Laodicea and others. So, for the imperial era writers, we arrive in a situation where the religious customs of the Northerners are vehicles for thinking about human diversity and the distinctiveness of population groups in an empire of many peoples, of course. And as has been so well demonstrated by many, Laura Nasrallah and many others, Christian writers whose pedigree grows, especially in Asia Minor, straight away from the second sophistic. Christian writers have no problem in taking over a very significant number of these markers of northern religion, indeed.
The description of Northern Europe, characterized in an insular sense, goes back to the first explorer who faced the risks of sailing from the Mediterranean to the British archipelago, for the first time defined as such, and who continued this adventure as far as Toul, fixed at 66 degrees north. I refer, of course, to Pytheas of Massalia, second half of the 4th century BC, whose work, The Ocean, was appreciated by scientists like Eratosthenes of Cyrene, but criticized by authors such as Polybius and Strabo, who were faithful interpreters of the geographical geography considered as an instrument of power. You can see the difference between the two representations of North in the slide, the first of Eratosthenes, a reconstruction of Eratosthenes' map with the oikumene, which goes until Toul, and Strabo, with one oikumene who goes until Yerne, Ireland. In this paper, I would like to focus on the northeastern area of the oceanic coast. For this large area, the comparison between the scarce fragments of Pytheas' work and the descriptions by Roman authors such as Strabo, Mela, and Pliny allows us to verify the conservative character of the literary tradition, which, on the one hand, accepts some data of a scientific nature, and on the other, does not renounce a stereotypical and fantastic image of the North. This comparison is not easy, also because the scarce fragments of the ocean relating to the extreme destination reached by Pytheas have been understood by moderns as relating to either the Baltic Sea or the North Sea, with obvious conflicting consequences in the assessment of the knowledge of the far north in the sources available to us. I still think that Pytheas limited his exploration to the North Sea. You can see the text in the fragment 15 of Pytheas' edition, my edition. It is to this context, therefore, that in my opinion, the information Pliny reports on the Amber Islands must refer. I quote, Pytheas, you can see the text. Pytheas says that the Guyones, a people of Germany, inhabit the shores of an estuary of the ocean called Metunidis, their territory extending a distance of 6,000 stadia. That, at one day's sail from this territory, is the isle of Abalus, upon the shores of which amber is thrown up by the waves in springs, it being an excretion of the sea in a concrete form. As also that the inhabitants use this amber by way of fuel and sell it to their neighbors, the Teutones. Timaeus, too, is of the same belief, but he has given to the island the name of Basilia. Philemon says that electrum does not yield a flame. Nicias, again, we have it, that is a liquid produced by the rays of the sun. End of quotation. A few words on this passage in relation to what interests us. The Metunides estuary has been variously localized, depending on the interpretation of Spatio Stadiorum 6 million, about 1,300 kilometers. This measurement could have been reported either with reference to the southeastern part of the North Sea, defined by geologists as the Wattenmeer, or to the Baltic Sea. As for the island Abalus, it is a day's sail from the coast and is identified with the peninsula of Samland or Sambia. You can see Sambia by those who point Pytheas to the Baltic. Alternatively, it is identified with the Danish island of Bornholm or Vendsyssel-Tai, an island that closes off the northern tip of Denmark, by those who believe that the Massaliot passed Skagerrak and Kattegat and ended his journey at the mouth of the Oder. Those who, on the other hand, believe that Pytheas did not go beyond the North Sea, identify Abalus with one of the Frisian islands or Helgoland. Here. From the passage by Pliny, examined here on the Amber Island, it seems to me that Timaeus called Basilia the Abalus of Pytheas, sed insulam Basiliam vocavit. Indeed, the historian was faithful to the description of the Massaliot, but integrated some of these data, translating into a toponymy which was more comprehensible to the reader. As in the case of the frozen sea, perhaps called Cronion by Timaeus himself, the historian of Tauromenion also Greekized the Pythian data for the Amber Island, making it more coherent within a story such as the return of Argonauts, which was adopted on the basis of the itinerary of the Massaliot's journey. We know this is the itinerary of Pythias' journey with two possible reconstruction to the North Sea and to the Baltic Sea. We know from Diodorus, you can see the text, who quotes Timaeus that after the theft of the Golden Fleece, the Argonauts, I quote, sailed, that is to say, up the Tanais River as far as its sources, and at a certain place they hauled the ship overland, and following in turn another river which flows into the ocean, they sailed down into the sea. Then they made their course from the north to the west, keeping the land on their left, and when they had arrived near Gadira, Cadiz, they sailed into our sea. End of quotation. The alternative route to the traditional one which Timaeus invents for the Argonauts in the light of the more recent exploration of the north thus seems to be modeled on that of Pytheas, who must have followed the European oceanic coast from Tanais to Gades from the return journey. However, it is known that the Tanais Don does not flow into the Northern Ocean, and therefore the reference to this river must be understood as a possible prolongation of the Don northwards, along the course of another river, perhaps the Elbe, that really did flow into the Northern Ocean. If Pytheas himself referred to the Tanais Don as the end of his journey, and if his Tanais represented in Pytheas' conception the extension to the north of the true Tanais, then we are faced with the definition of a point of the oceanic coast that marked the extremity of the Europe-Asia border. This leads to the conclusion that Pytheas' oceanic coast ran along Europe beyond which the Massaliot had not reached. Let us now return to Pliny's passage from which we began our analysis. In addition to Timaeus, Pliny mentioned Philemon and Nicias in connection with amber, probably proceeding according to a method that brought together different theories on amber production. Of Nicias, nothing is known, while of Philemon we know that he lived between 5 and 60 CE, and wrote a work on the islands of the Outer Sea. Of the 4 fragments passed down to us, 3 by Pliny and 1 by Ptolemy, the fragment transmitted by Ptolemy dealt with Hierne Ireland, and Philemon claimed to have obtained from merchants the extent of the island in an east-west direction. You can see the This is the edition in New Jacobi from Philemon. Upo emporon. Philemon is also mentioned together with Timaeus in another passage by Pliny. You can see the text. Pliny is 494 until 97. I quote, "We must now leave the Euxine to describe the outer portion of Europe. After passing the Riphean mountains, we have now to follow the shores of the Northern Ocean on the left, until we arrive at Gades. In this direction, a great number of islands are said to exist that have no name, among which there is one which lies opposite to Scythia, mentioned under the name of Baunonia, and said to be at a distance of the day's sail from the mainland, and upon which, according to Timaeus, amber is thrown up by the waves in the spring season. As to remaining parts of these shores, they are almost unknown, but the North Ocean is object of authoritative reports. Hecatæus of Abdera, Hecatæus calls it Amalchian Sea. Philemon again says that it's called Morimarusa, or the Dead Sea by the Cimbri, as far as the promontory of Rusbeas, beyond which it has the name of the Cronian Sea. Xenophon of Lampsacus tells us that at a distance of 3 days' sail from the shore of Scythia, there is an island of immense size called Balchia, which by Pytheas is called Basilia. Some islands called Oeonae are said to be here, the inhabitants of which live on the eggs of birds and oats, and others again upon which human beings are produced with the feet of horses, thence called Hippopodes. Some other islands are also mentioned as those of the Phanesii, the people of which have ears of such extraordinary size as to cover the rest of the body, which is otherwise left naked. Leaving this, however, we come to the nation of the Ingueones, the first in Germany. In their country is an immense mountain called Saevo, not less than those of the Riphean range, and which forms an immense gulf along the shore as far as the promontory of the Cimbri. This gulf, which is called Codanus, is filled with islands, the most famous among which is Catinavia, of a magnitude as yet unascertained. The only portion of it at all known is inhabited by the nation of the Illeviones, who live in 500 villages, and call it a second world. It is generally supposed that the island of Aeninja is of not less magnitude. Some writers state that these regions, as far as the river Vistula, are inhabited by the Sarmati, the Venedi, the Sciri, and the Hirli, and that there is a gulf there known by the name of Kilipenus, at the mount of which is the island of Latris, after which comes another gulf, that of Lagnos, which borders on the Cimbri. Passing this coast, there are 23 islands which have been made known by the Roman arms, the most famous of which is Burcana, called by our people Fabaria, from the resemblance borne by a fruit which grows there spontaneously. There are those also called Glesaria by our soldiers from their amber, but by the barbarians they are known as Austeravia and Actania. End of quotation. This long Plinian passage begins with a description of the extreme edges of Europe, with a direction from the east to Gades, i.e. along the line drawn by Pytheas, who, as we have said, set the Tanais as the northeastern extremity of his navigation. The description includes the Amber Islands, also mentioned in the passage where Pytheas and Timaeus are mentioned, by the latter giving credit to explorer calling Basilian the Pythian Abalus. In the passage in Book 4, Pliny combines information from different sources, which are not entirely connected, as can be seen from the direction of the description, which at first goes from the extreme borders of Europe, Tanais, to Gades, and then moves on to the description of the islands in the Sinus Codanus, i.e. in the Baltic Sea. Indeed, the expression insulae cum plures sine nomidibus refers to the islands of the North Sea, while the Sinus Codanus refertus insulis quarum clarissima est Scandinavia undoubtedly indicates the Baltic Sea, which seems to have its western end in the promontorium Rusbeas, identified with the northern cape of Jutland, i.e. Cape Skagen, or Cape Lindesnes, at the southern tip of Norway, or the island of Rivingen in the same area. The largest of the islands enclosed by this gulf is Scandinavia. In 4.104, Pliny mentions Scandiae Insulae, this being echoed by Ptolemy, the geographer, who mentions 4 of them, with Scandia being considered the largest of his archipelago, which is identifiable with the Danish islands. Pliny's text then proceeds with information derived from different and not perfectly integrated sources. The island of Latris, which can be identified with Sealand, and the mention the Sinus Lagnus also seem to refer to unspecified quidam sum. Pliny then compares this with the information reported by Roman troops, Romanis armis, militiae, on the coast west of Jutland, with the discovery of 23 islands, including Burkana, the islands of the broad beans. Basically, the official information which was related to the Roman army is limited to the region west of Jutland, i.e. the North Sea, for which reason it was possible to compare Pytheas' description with more recent ones. The Baltic space, destined to enter Roman official knowledge rather late, appears to have filtered into Pliny's texts through unofficial information, collected from one or more sources, which mixed real data, probably for trade nature, with the traditions about fabulous inhabitants of regions in the far north. The definition of Scandinavia as alter orbis is probably a report from travelers who ascribed to the locals a definition that actually related to their own conception of the world, and in relation to which Scandinavia represented a total otherness. However, we have to say that the first mention of Scandinavia predates Pliny and is found in Pomponius Mela, who wrote a chorography during the time of Claudius. Mela's description, you have the text here and a reconstruction of the Ecumene of Mela, Mela's description of the North is bookish and up-to-date only as far as a few place names are concerned, for example Scandinavia, which are moreover inserted in context which references to legendary peoples, birds of prey, horse feet. You can see the text and I quote, "To the north of Britain, Juverna is more or less equal in area, but is oblong with equally extended lateral coastlines. The 30 Orcades are separated by narrow spaces between them. The 7 Hemodae extend opposite Germany, and what we have called Codanus Bay. Of the islands there, Scandinavia, which the Teutonic still hold, stands out as much for its size as for its fertility. Because of the sea's tidal ebb and flow, and because the distance between them is sometimes covered by waves, and is at other time bare, what faces the Sarmati sometimes seem to be islands, and at other times seem to be one continuous land mass. In addition to what is handed down in legend, I discover, in authors whom I'm not embarrassed to follow, that on these islands are the Oeonai, who feed only on oats and the eggs of marsh birds, and that the Hippopodes, with their equine hooves, are also there, and the Panotii, too, who for clothing have big ears, broad enough to go around their whole body. They are otherwise naked. Toul is located near the coast of the Belkae." End of quotation. Silbermann, in this important commentary on Mela, has identified a Greek source behind the description of Yerne and the North Sea Islands. Since Mela is the first to mention the Orkney Islands, the source he draws on could be Pytheas or, according to Silbermann, Philemon, whom we have already quoted precisely because he mentioned Yerne, attributing a large extent to the island. The 7 Hemodae are only mentioned by Mela and Pliny 4.103 and are not identified. It is excluded that these are the Hebrides mentioned by Pliny, so it appears that the naturalist knew them both. Silbermann sees in it a reference to the Danish islands south of Sweden, located in the Sinus Codanus. Because of the similarities between the description by Pliny and Mela, Silbermann thought of a common source from which the two might have drawn and proposed the name of Philemon. It is difficult to reconstruct the characteristics of Philemon's work, which has come down to us in 4 fragments, but it seems to me that the work on the islands could have been connected to a tradition inaugurated by Eudoxus of Cnidos, 4th century BC, author of the first Isolarium or list of islands, which was contained within his geographical work entitled Periodos tes Ges. The success of this tradition is testified by Diodorus' Book 5, the Book of Islands, which reveals the different articulation of a literary production that, starting from the Hellenistic age, had dedicated much space to the theme of islands. The interest in remote islands, enhanced by Alexander's adventure, also created the basis for fantastic literature in which islands were configured as the places of utopia. Elixoia by Hecateus of Abdera, Panchaia by Euhemerus, the islands of Jambulus, are all fantastic places whose location, however, depends on the broadened horizons following Alexander's expedition. We know that Augustus's expedition and also the campaign of Drusus in the middle course of the Elbe in 9 BC, or those undertaken by Tiberius sailing along the lower Elbe and presumably beyond into the North Sea as far as Cape Skagen, do not seem to have made any great contributions to knowledge of the North. More than from these military expeditions, it seems to me that the Melas and Pliny's descriptions may derive from a literary source, presumably Philemon, which include recent data of a commercial nature combined with data from a fantastic tradition regarding the peoples of the North. A more precise reality of the relations between Rome and the North, in particular with the Baltic, can be inferred for the 1st century CE from archaeological data. In particular, a network of commercial relations emerges from the so-called Hobby treasure. This is a Roman burial site on the island of Lolland in Denmark. You can see the island, Lolland, and discovered in 1920 during the digging of a drain and excavated by archaeologists from the National Museum of Denmark. The grave contained the most complete set of imported tableware found so far from early Roman Iron Age Scandinavia, including 2 unique silver cups decorated with scenes from Homer's Iliad. The 2 Roman drinking cups are signed by Cheirisopos, a Greek craftsman. Thank you. The 2 Roman drinking cups, allora, approfitto. The 2 Roman drinking cups are signed by Cheirisopos, a Greek craftsman who worked in Italy, and are engraved with the name Cilius. This name, however, does not prove that the drinking cup was directly or indirectly handed over in 1421 by the commander of the Roman Upper Germany army, Gaius Cilius. On the 2 silver cups from Hobby, one of the scenes depicted illustrates the Roman perception of the relationship between themselves and the Germanic populations of North and Central Europe. It is the scene in which the Trojan king Priam kneels before Achilles and asks him to hand over his son's body. Achilles is portrayed as the ideal athletic Roman, while Priam is dressed like a German person, i.e. a barbarian. The depiction shows the barbarian surrendering to the Roman, the scene being a symbol of the Romans' perception of themselves. What we can deduce from this documentation is that the Baltic area, which would enter into official Roman knowledge somewhat later, seems to be described in the sources examined here through information referring to a dense trade network of exchanges, to which the Hobby treasury is a witness. The literary sources, as we have seen, present a confused picture of this same reality, which was not institutionally integrated with the Orbis Romanus, and which only recorded conquered lands. The absence of a scientific cartography which, in parallel with the knowledge acquired, could update the progressively acquired data, explain the uncertainties that continued to exist in Ptolemy's geography regarding the Baltic area. The geographer, in fact, calls Scandiae 4 islands of the Sinus Codanus, but then gives the name Scandia to the largest and extremest of them. It is now time to draw some conclusion from what has been discussed so far in relation to the islands of the north, or the far northeast. Pythias' exploration, which reached the mouth of the Elbe, still constitutes an indisputable reference point for the North Sea area in the Imperial Age. Pythias' text must have enjoyed fortune among scientific geographers, but not among historical geographers like Polybius and Strabo. Within the tradition of scientific geography, initiated by Eudoxus of Cnidos, the idea took the form of a list of islands, divided into Mediterranean islands and Oceanic islands. This tradition was destined to be successful, as the Book of Islands by Diodorus Siculus demonstrates. To this trade can be linked Philemon's work The Islands of the Ocean, written in the 1st century CE. Especially in the Hellenistic age, we can observe the growth of fantastic geography that nevertheless takes its inspiration from serious geographical description. Thus, Hecatæus of Abdera described Elixoias Island in his On the Hyperboreans on the basis of Pythias, and Antonius Diogenes in The Wonders Beyond Thule considered Thule as a boundary between the real and the apiston. Monstrous peoples could find their place in this fortunate tradition. We have to say that the impulse to conquer the world drove the Romans in the age of Augustus to explore the area east of Jutland without, however, acquiring a scientifically founded picture of the far northeast. Our sources, in particular Mela and Pliny, give us a kind of stratigraphy of information that allows us to intuit the importance of an author such as Philemon. From the mention of the mercantile sources consulted by Philemon for Yernen, mentioned by Ptolemy, we can guess the importance of a trade network that connected the East with the amber trade to the West with the tin trade. The existence of this dense network is documented for the Eastern Ocean by the Hobby treasure, which allows us to integrate what the literary tradition does not say, due to a political vision of spaces that only enter the map through conquest. Like Pythias' tool, the islands of the Baltic were also destined for a long time to represent a mundus alter, as opposed to the Mediterranean. The persistence in our historical geographical tradition of places inhabited by monsters probably responded to a political strategy of removing and or confining to the extremes of the inhabited world everything that did not serve the exigencies of government. The fortunes of this type of conception were destined to endure throughout the Middle Ages, and particularly centered on the areas of the far north, at least until the Renaissance, when the great geographical discoveries would lead to the idea of a new world to be read according to new scientific coordinates. Thank you.
I am very thankful, Antti, for invitation to this conference, especially because this conference is focused on similar topics, so I can understand the lectures of my colleagues, and I hope my lecture will be also understandable. And I'm very thankful that I have more than 15 minutes, because in modern conferences, 15 minutes is absolutely the impossible to be crossed time. I try to talk about the original Greek imagination about European North before the Celts and Scythians. What it means? Scythians and Celts are people from the early Iron Age, Central Europe, also Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but mainly Northern Europe. And the Scythians are first mentioned in a fragment of Hesiodus, together with Ethiopians and Libyans. And the Scythians are, in this fragment, described by Homeric epithets Hippemolgus. And of course, the date of this Hesiod fragment is impossible to be strictly established. However, in the Near East sources, Ishkuzaya or Mat Ashguzaya Scythians are mentioned at the beginning of the 7th century. So this date, circa 700 years before Christ, is a date of the beginning of the Pontic Scythian culture, and the Scythian culture in the Inner Asia, in some parts of Siberia or rather some great steppe territories, are dated since the 900 years before. The Celts are mentioned for the first time, for sure, by Herodotus in his description of the Western Europe and the sources of the Danube River, but probably they were also mentioned by Hecataeus a little bit earlier. And the Celts are connected with the Hallstatt culture, which is the culture both in the late Bronze Age as well as in early Iron Age, and the successive culture of the Hallstatt was Latene, and Latene was for sure the culture connected with Gauls, Celts, Galatians, as well as we can say it. So the beginning of those two northern barbarian people is connected with the beginning of the classical or archaic Greek word, Hellenic word with Polish alphabet, Olympic Games, literature. So the new Hellenic word, for us it's classical word, after the end of Dark Ages and after the long period of Bronze Age Greece, when we called this Greece Mycenaean. So the Scythians and Celts are archetypical northern barbarians. Of course, as Antti says, there is some common vision of northern people in the Greek literature. However, there's also some kind of dichotomy between the Western people and Eastern. The main problem probably is the main reason of this dichotomy is the way of life, nomadic life, with the importance of horses in Scythians, and some kind of also nomadic life, but based on the other principles than Scythians in the western part. Later, Scythians were in ancient sources changed to Sarmatians, and Celts were also changed to Germanic peoples, the new examples of common archetypical northern barbarians. But of course we can connect those barbarians with some linguistic issues, but for the ancient writers, it was mainly this ethnography was based on the type of life, I suppose. So, but who inhabited north before Scythians and Celts, and as well before the Homer times, before the archaic Greece? It's not a question concerning only with the archaeology and some linguistic comparative studies trying to find the proto-languages, but it's also the question of the real connections between Mediterranean world and Central Europe, Northern Europe. This is a real trade networks in the Bronze Age, network in which the Mycenaean or Minoan-Mycenaean zone, as Barry Cunliffe wrote, was important, but only a part. The other important part was Carpathian Basin, the Nordic zone, and some western parts. So there is excellent description of this Central European Bronze Age cultures in archaeological denominations. However, the names of archaeological cultures are artificial invention of modern scholars. Of course, it's impossible to expect that in ancient times there were some ethnoses, some peoples who called themselves Urnfield people, Lusatian people, and so on. Of course, we even are not sure if those archaeological cultures are in reality some political, social, or ethnic entities, or it is only some attempt to make a map of Bronze Age archaeology based on the only disponible sources, the archaeological artifacts, physical sources, because this word, as you see, many details, many names, many cultures, but with no names from this time. We haven't any ethnic name, any personal name. It's for us word full of artifacts. Mm-hmm. This word is full of artifacts, but it's absolutely mute. Those people say nothing about their names, their identity, their ethnic, their personal names. So, is it possible to find any traces of this northern past in existing written sources? Those sources from the most remote past could be only in one language, only in Greek language. And there are some evidence of trade routes in Bronze Age Europe, Central Europe, which connected to the Mediterranean world. Of course, those routes are also invention of archaeologists who create a network of connections between artifacts found in many places of Europe. However, those artifacts are probably possible to create some map of trade routes. One of them, the most important, is of course the Amber route, connecting northern part of Europe, northern seas and oceans with Mediterranean world. But there are also other possible routes, the mentioned tin routes. And those northern networks is connected with the Mediterranean network in the region of Adriatic, in the region of Venice, and probably also southern Gaul. So, even if we do not believe in the routes put on the map by modern archaeologists, scholars, cartographers, we can think about the artifacts which are possible to be found in situ. For example, amber inscribed in Linear B from Bergstorm in Bavaria. This is a small object, so some people are not convinced it is genuine. Some says it could be forgery, like for example Kafkania pebble, which is for sure forgery made on the occasion of the feast April, the Day of Fools. However, in Poland, in southern Poland, in Maszkowice, was founded a Mycenaean settlement. Of course, Mycenaean could be only some metaphorical, but for sure in Maszkowice is a settlement with some kind of Cyclopean masonry, stone masonry. It is so unexpected in Poland because the date of this settlement is 1,700 years before Christ. And the next stone building in Poland was built, as we know now from the archaeological excavation, 3,000 years later, only at the beginning of the Middle Ages in Poland, beginning of the Christianity Poland. Poland at that time was typical country of the wooden architecture. So this is absolutely unexpected, and even if we can forge a small amber inscribed in Linear B, it's impossible to forge Cyclopean masonry in Zyndram Hills, Poland, southern Poland, Maszkowice. So, it's a question, what in Greek tradition about the north dates from the pre-Scythian and pre-Celtic era before 700 years before? We expect that the Homeric epic, as Franco Mottari says, and also Greek mythological tradition has distant reminiscences of Mycenaean Greece. And it's impossible that, as Montanari says, it tells of a past that it transfigures into a correct settings where historical reality and invention are not fully distinguishable. So, do Greek written sources and iconographic artifacts convey some information about the world of the Bronze Age or early Iron Age north before 700, of course not AD, BC is my fault. If there are some informations, they are for sure based on some oral tradition, some collective memory and some poetical imagination, invention with use of many artifacts. And this collective memory is updated with new experiences in successive generations. So written and iconographic sources could propose us some survey into the world, which is reminiscence of Mycenaean world in northern Europe. However, these archetypes are in shadow. So if you want to find some traces of the oldest mention about North, we should examine, should scrutinize the disponible sources. And before Scythians were Cimmerians, before Celts were Hyperboreans. This is some hypothesis. Is it really true? Cimmerians as a typical horse riders, Hyperboreans as people from the wooden part of Europe, not from a steppe. But is it really true? The oldest testimony, the oldest example of the word of Cimmerians, word before Scythians, is in Homer Odyssey, where Cimmerians are the people of the far west. And they live in the shadow, misty, cloudy country. However, the Cimmerians were known not from the west part of the world, Okumene, but they lived in the Pontic area before Scythians. And Cimmerians were also very active in the Near East, in Asia Minor, as we can find from some fragment by Kallinos, who mentioned the excursions of Cimmerians and Treres to Asia Minor against the Greek police in this area. So how it is possible that Cimmerians are the people of the West, but in real geography, as we can say, it's country of the people from the East, North and East. So let's remember this fragment and another, maybe the oldest description of North in the Homer Iliad. These are famous fragments. I suppose that all of you know it very well. However, it's not important what is written. It is important, but it's also important what is not mentioned in this description of the North. There are not mentions Scythians. There are not mentions, of course, Celts, not mentions Hyperboreans, but there are also Thracians, Mesians, and some riders feeding on milk, mare milk, and of course, just people, as Antti says, some example of wise Northern barbarians. What is most important in this fragment is that this is also some kind of dichotomy between riders and those people who fight as infantry. Meson, anchemachon. Anchemachon, it means Mesoi fight as infantry. Thracians are riders, as well as those not mentioned as Scythians, but mentioned as a people with the way of life based on the horse breeding. And the first mentions about Scythians is in the Hesiod fragments, a little bit later from Homer, where is they used the same epithet, hypemolgus, like in Homeric fragments. However, in Homeric fragments, there are any mentions of any tribes, any ethnic names. Of course, in this edition, Abion is written with the big letter at the beginning, as it could be ethnic name. But this could be the oldest description of the North, with dichotomy: riders, not riders, barbarians. Of course, later there are many informations about this hypemolgus. For Callimachus, the Cimmerians were hypemolgoi, Scythians, so it is typical for the northern horse breeding people. However, I tried to make some distinction for the most remote past between Cimmerians and Hyperboreans. Cimmerians as a horse-riding barbarians and Hyperboreans as some ancestors of Celts. However, if we look at this Hesiod fragment, where are mentioned Skytai, Hypemolgei, later there are also some verse where Hyperboreans are mentioned, with the epithets Ewippon. Ewippoi, it means good in horses. So in these Hesiodic fragments, Hyperboreans are as well horse-riding nomads, not the people from the woodland, as we can expect, not Celts. So let's look at the archaeological map. Where are Cimmerians located according to archaeological findings? Of course, this is Pontic area. Pontic area connected with the Nowocherkask culture, the neighbor of Hallstatt culture. So the area of Cimmerians is Pontic, but it's also expanded west toward the Thrace. So this is the reason that some say that Cimmerians were not Iranian, but Thracian people. We have any evidence to discern these problems who were ethnically, linguistically Cimmerians. However, they were connected not only with the steppes, but also with the Central Europe, Danube zone, and from Danube zone is not far to the Adriatic near Venice. So if Greeks connected some network with the northern parts of Europe, and if they met with Cimmerians, they could met with them not only in the Pontic region, but also near the Adriatic region from in the west of Oikumene, west of Europe, not on the east. It could be some explanation why for Homerus Cimmerians are the people of the west. And let's see on Herodotus, the other famous fragment about Cimmerians, about their fight against Scythians, about their failure, where defeated Cimmerians migrated to the Near East and made some troubles in Media, Assyria as well. In that fragment, Herodotus made some mention about Aristeas of Proconnesus, the famous poet, the famous shaman, as some say, the famous traveler. However, we are not sure if it was a real travel or only some spiritual travel as a person who was Phoibolamptos, catched by Apollo. And Proconnesus is a party of it's a city in the Propontis, Marmara Sea, and it is of course some trace of Greek tradition concerning exploration of the Pontic area. So in Herodotus are mentioned some. So there is a list of northern people. I make some additional numbers to show this list because it's from the west to the east and back. So Aristeas, in his spiritual or real travel, goes to Isedones, then to one-eyed Arimaspians. After Arimaspians were Griffons, the guardians of gold, and after Griffons were Hyperboreans, and what is most important, after Hyperboreans was sea, Thalassa. And it is accepted from scholars that it was journey from the west to the east along the Great Steppe. So the Griffons are sometimes located in the Jungaria, near Mongolian border. So Arimaspians were sometimes supposed to be Chinese people, but also Hyperboreans are possible mentioned of Chinese people if we connect this travel of Aristeas to the east. However, it's also some travel back, which is very famous fragment about the attacks on barbarians once against another, and one attack creates another attack. So Arimaspians fight against Isedonas, Isedonas fight against Scythians, and Scythians fight against Cimmerians. So Cimmerians were needed to migrate to Asia. However, it's one important question. Twice in this fragment is mentioned sea, Thalassa. Cimmerians escaped from Scythians near sea, and for sure it was Black Sea. Hyperboreans are living near the sea. And once again, Cimmerians are living near the southern sea, Epite Notia Thalassa. So, if the sea of Cimmerians is not here, where is the opposite sea? It must be northern sea. Jungaria is in the middle of the Asia. There is any sea in this area, or maybe some lakes like Balkhash Lake or Baikal, but it is possible to explain this epithet Notia Thalassa only if we suppose that the Northern Sea is not a lake in the inner Asia, but just the Baltic Sea. In such a directions, the travel of Aristeas was not west-east, but from south to the north. And in that case, Chrysophilakes Grypes lived probably in the southern slopes of Carpathians. Riffian mountains could be just Carpathians. And of course, Hyperboreans are people living between Carpathians and Baltic Sea. If we compare with the map of the diffusion of metallurgy, we can see that the gold ore could be found especially in the area of modern Transylvania, Romania. And the origin of the gold metallurgy is also in Balkans. Of course, gold is very famous also in the Scythian culture. However, at the beginning, the most important and most more near to the Greek world was the findings in the northern part of Balkans. So, if you want to discern this problem and locate some mentions of ancient archaic poetry about north, we should think about the possible routes to the north. And I intentionally use the anachronic map from the times of the Roman Empire. We can also use the other map from the medieval times, or even from the early modern times, because from the Greece, from the Mediterranean world, there are 4 routes toward north. The one of them is around the Europe via Gibraltar Strait. It is used sometimes if it's really needed, like for example after the Second World War, where the communist fleet tried to evacuate Greek partisans to Poland, for example. But there are 3 much more useful routes. The shortest is Balkan route. Along the rivers Strymon, Morava, Danube, Tisa, Vag, crossing Carpathian Mountains, and Vistula. However, the shortest route was not always safe, and it was many times closed. Especially in modern times, it was closed because some hostility between Habsburg and Ottoman Empire. So there are other 2 alternative routes. The one is route via Black Sea, Pontic route. It was used many times and it was very popular in the archaic times when the Greeks colonized this area and when they tried to make some settlements, some fisheries or some emporiums around the Pontic Sea. However, this area of Black Sea was probably inaccessible for the Greeks, or rather should I say Mycenaeans, in the Bronze Age. Because of Troy, it was a very important factor, as important that some Greek poetry is located in the times of the Trojan War, and because of a current in the Bosphorus. The current of Bosphorus allow people sail from the Black Sea to the Marmara and Aegean Sea. The other directions from the Marmara Sea to Black Sea is very difficult. So this is the reason why Argonauts were esteemed as a very excellent sailors, because they crossed the Bosphorus. Of course, there were trade in the Bronze Age period also in this time, but not via sea, but crossing isthmus in Thrace. And the last one is the route via Adriatic, from Greece to Venice, and from Venice is the shortest way to the Northern Sea. Northern Seas, I should say, because it's North Sea as well as Black Sea. And it was the trade route of Amber, the famous Amber route. So this was shortest route. And I mentioned this Polish Mycenaean settlement in Maszkowice. It's in the southern Poland, near the Karpaty. There are also another settlement in Trzcinica, where are Mycenaean pottery, but only pottery, without any architectural structures. And this is, of course, called Mycenaean, but in reality, there is influenced by Ottomani, Füzesaboni culture from the Tisa region, and Moncodonia, Gradina, Mycenaean influenced culture from Istria. So here in Poland, in Maszkowice, we can find a settlement which was built under the influence or under some technical supervision by architects who were not from Mycenaean world, but who know how to build Mycenaean masonry, cyclops walls. Now is the question, what is north? North is one of the 4 cardinal directions, and north could be based on some astral phenomena as the Arctos, Ursa Major, or some idea of midnight. But north could be based also on the winds, the direction of winds. And it was the other called the Greek name for north, Boreas, as opposite wind to Notos. And at the beginning it was probably only 2 winds on this rows. Later were added Euros and Zephyros. And what it means, Boreas? There are many hypotheses, but one is, for me, convincing. Boreas is the same like Slavic word Gora. It means mountain. So Hyperboreas would be people over the northern wind, but also over the mountain. And from the north of Greece, there are many mountains. So the location of Hyperboreas could change according to the generations and centuries. Hyperboreas could be people from the north of the Rhodope mountains, north of Balkan mountains, north of Carpathian mountains, or even Alp, because it was some continuity of mountains which divided Europe into 2 parts, the flat part on the north and the hilly mountains part of the south. So this is possible that Boreas were probably clear north, but in the Hellenistic times it was a little bit turned to the east by Timosthenes, for whom Boreas was the north-northeast wind. And this term was accepted by Latin authors. And because of the influence of Latin authors, it was also influenced the European scholars, that we expect that Boreas is the wind from the Pontus, Meotis, country of Sarmatians. However, at the beginning, probably Boreas was shifted a little bit west, because not the Pontic area, but the Adriatic area was especially important in the late Bronze Age. And at Hesiodus Theogony, we can find some rivers, children of Thetis and Okeanos, and 4 rivers are connected with cardinal directions: Neilos, south; Eridanos, north; Istros, west or east? West, because Phasis is the east. This is a problematic question, and as this geography of northern countries were problematic, is an example of the routes of Argonauts, which were very clear at the beginning, from the Greece to the Colchis, to the east, to the Phasis River, and how to go home, how to back. So Apollonius Rhodes of Rhodes creates the idea that the return home was via Danube, Adriatic, then again North Adriatic, Eridanos, it means Po River, and via Africa to Greece. However, there are various locations of Eridanos. It could be Po River, but the first author who located Eridanos in the northern Italy was Euripides. Earlier, Eridanos was a river ending in Northern Ocean, like we can see from the Scholia to Apollonius of Rhodes, where this is a place where live nymph who informed Heracles how to find a way to Nereus and later to golden apples. Argonauts in Pindar are going home completely different way around the southern part of the world. And it is very similar to the Io wanderings described in the Prometheus Vinctus. When Io goes far north, then turn home, and around the southern part of Ecumene, she arrived to Egypt, where married a king and became a goddess. So, in Prometheus Vinctus, we have some very interesting details where Prometheus advises Io how to find a way to her new country, to Egypt. So she should go to the west, but she should also avoid some parts of the Ecumene. She should avoid Gorgonia, Pedia, Kistenis. Very important is the word Pedia. And Kistenes. What is Kistene? According to Strabo, is a polis eremos near Adramyttion. According to Hippocration, is a Oros Destrakis, mountain in Thracia. According to Scholia Trais Hylos, is a Libyan or Ethiopian city. So where is the place of Gorgons? To the north, to the west, or to the south? After Pedia Kistenes, Io should avoid Grippas, guardians of the gold, and Arimaspians, who are here, the people searching for a gold and breeding horses. So the Io wanders were in the northern part, eastern part, southern part, as well as Argonauts. There are many, sometimes absolutely unexpected routes of Argonauts, like in Timaeus, via Tanais River, or in Orphic Argonauts, via Danube, and here, not to the south, like in Apollonius Rhodius, but to the north, to the Baltic area. Why there was so many discrepancies according to Argonauts' wanderings? Because there were many images of north in the later Greek traditions. It was a contamination of some traditions. So some hypotheses were created about Greek image of the world by Rachel Gottesman in her paper, The Wanderings of Io, Spatial Readings into Greek Mythology. She created some image of a Greek world with the center in the Mediterranean Sea, then Okumene and Perata, Gaius, and ocean. But this is very symmetrical image with the similar distance to the north, south, west, and east. And it's very similar to the Chinese idea of the world with the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo in the middle, and some four barbarians, Nanman on the south, Beidi on the north, Dongyi on the east, and Xizhong on the west. And many wanderings of Greek heroes are put on this map, and those are mainly wanderings toward west, towards the Gibraltar Strait. However, the Greek world was not symmetrical. It was turned to the west because Adriatic Sea route was one of the most important in this earlier Mycenaean Bronze Age. The route based on the trade of amber, but also tin as well. And sometimes there are traces of old traditions, as in Aristotle or pseudo-Aristotle, Mirabiles Auscultationes, where there are mentioned Electrici Nessois, the islands of Electridas, in the Micho to Adrio, so near the Venice. And there are Dio Andriantas, Dio statues, one Cassiterinaon from tin, and the second Halcyon, the bronze. And those statues are of Daedalus' authorship, because he traveled to this area escaping Minos from Crete and from Sicily. So this tale, paradoxical description by pseudo-Aristotle is full of all topics connected with the amber, connected with the northern countries, like the myth about Phaeton, his sister, and their tears as a amber. However, we can find many traces of some knowledge of Greeks or Mycenaeans in the Bronze Age about the north. This image is very scattered, and there are also some shadow information about amber and horses, about big river or big rivers and northern ocean, about mountains and gold. North and west, those two directions sometimes appear interchangeable and in similar conditions. North and west are the place of darkness, fog. So the ethnic and geographical situation of the north before Scythians and Celts is completely obliterated and mythologized at the dawn of the archaic Greek. There are some original, the original significance of this area is indicated, but placements of many myths there. The north is the place where heroes wander. It's about of the deities, nymphs, monsters, etc. But in the early Iron Age, this area lost significance. And it is indicated by a transfer of original myths and imaginary associated with the north to the west, but also to the east and even to south, as in case of Gorgons. And this was another important question. The Mycenaean world was to north, were turned to the west, to the area of Adriatic Sea. The archaic Greece was turned to the east, to the Pontic region. And in later Greek tradition, it was a contamination of those two elements. Earlier Adriatic area, later Pontic area. And sometimes Greek authors has no possibility to create a common image from those two different traditions concerning two different geographical directions. So thank you very much for invitation, and I hope I explain you my main idea despite these technical problems.